Well, I always say that learning is a process which you never forget, in the sense that you keep on learning all the time. And for me, what Sean said now is doubly important, because I've always believed, and I said that yesterday, and one of the colleagues here told me, I like the thing that you talked about, intellect and experience. As a lawyer, we are only used to working from books. This is what I call intellectual knowledge. But that is never complete, and it's only a part of it. And unless you have the experiential knowledge of being in the space where you are stigmatized, discriminated, unless that happens, which is what I call experiential knowledge, you cannot actually get a full picture of society. So the marriage of intellect and experience is key to any understanding of reality. And that for me is very important, and that's why when actually Sean expresses his emotions, it touches me. I've seen this over a period. I started working in HIV in '87, so I'm not a very young person anymore. Okay, I normally do PowerPoints, but whenever there's an important issue, I actually write speeches. So I was writing my speech over the flight, and I considered this a very, very, very important area because of stigma all over the world. And I must tell you, before I start formally reading the speech, just before I took off from Delhi, I was arguing one of the constitutional cases on privacy, because the government is challenging that there is no right to privacy in the Indian Constitution. We don't have a written right, explicit right. So that came up. And one of the lawyers from the government side actually argued, how can you countenance privacy as a fundamental right? Because that would even mean drug users claiming privacy. Can you believe this? This is the argument. Anyway, I rebutted that in as aggressive as you can be in court. And I told them he was basically talking rubbish, but I didn't say that in those words. So friends and comrades, let me start by saying that it is indeed an honor for me to be present here amongst all of you at this very important conference. Indeed, I'm privileged to deliver the plenary address at the closing ceremony on an issue that is very close to my heart. I am thankful to the organizers of the event, particularly Sean Shelley and TB HIV Care Association, for inviting me to present this address. I come here as the Commissioner of Global Commission on Drug Policy and as its representative. The Commission is headed by Ms. Ruth Dreyfus and several former presidents and heads of states, including leading political figures who are respected throughout the world. I'm the only exception, by the way. I'm not a president, I'm not a politician, so you can see the scale of my fellow African commissioners include Mr. Kofi Anand and Mr. Obasanjo. The Commission has produced excellent evidence-based reports analyzing war on drugs and HIV, the negative impact on HIV, on the war on drugs on public health, the hidden hepatitis C epidemic, amongst others. I would sincerely urge you to go to its website and get information on the subjects of your deliberations. I'm sure you've had a useful dialogue to critically examine the laws, policies, and practices in vogue today and around the world, and in particular in South Africa. Reflect on them so as to give inputs for South African government to take on board. And in this context, I join Sean in thanking all people who have come from the government, particularly police officers. And I think without their cooperation and without a dialogue with them, we can't move forward. It is important that communities of persons using drugs, working for drug users, and government representatives engage in a dialogue. And that is what I call the marriage of intellect and experience. It is indeed appropriate that Drug Policy Week is being held in South Africa to chalk out a strategy for drug control for the future. I am reminded of the statement by the Honorable Deputy Minister Henrietta Bogopane Zulu to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, CND, who noted that human rights is a point of departure on drug policy of the African Union. She further stated, comprehensive, accessible, evidence-informed, ethical and human rights-based drug use prevention, dependence treatment and aftercare services is our hallmark. That would indeed be an ideal framework. Traditionally in sub-Saharan Africa, cannabis or daga and khat were the two main cultivated drug crops. Like elsewhere in the world, they were grown for ritual, medical and recreational purposes. Cannabis has been culturally used by traditional communities in this part of the world. But the use of it was regulated by local rules and values. Cannabis use in Africa is much higher than the global average. From the 60s, its use increased and became popular, particularly in South Africa, Kenya and Nigeria, and mostly amongst young people. And I take the professor's point, it is used by poor people because it is cheap. And this is very important to understand. And according to the UN report, drug use in South Africa is still largely centered around cannabis use, where almost 4% of the population are considered frequent users. It is the most commonly used drug in South Africa. The present laws, policies, and practices the world over are a product and mandated by the 3 UN conventions of 61, 71, and 1988. Their origins lie in the 19th century notions among moral and evangelical groups about the use of opium and cannabis in the colonies, please mark that, and whose lobbying culminated in certain states, basically the US, pushing for universal drug prohibition. There is also a racial prejudice in the nature of drug regulation. Thus, alcohol, the point the professor made, and tobacco, recreational drugs of the white colonizing people are not criminalized. But coca, cannabis, and opium drugs of the colonized people are. Please mark this difference. This is a culturally articulated prohibition. In South Africa, racism and exploitative nature of drug law is evident from the Rag Commission report 1887, very well known as the Indian Immigrant Commission, which noted that, now please note this, we see no just reason, they said, why the Indian immigrant should not be content to consume tobacco and to forego the use of the plant, cannabis of course, which is highly injurious to his constitution, but more importantly, which disables him from fulfilling the contract for which he has been brought to the colony. So exploitation. The prohibition was specifically aimed at Indians. Significantly, all 3 conventions recognize their primary objective in protecting, and please note this, the health and welfare of humankind. This is very important. The real question before you in South Africa is whether to follow the path of enforcement or that of human rights, health, and the well-being of the people in South Africa. Indeed, South Africa, in choosing the latter path, would lead the world out of this abyss. There is no doubt, at least in my mind, that the enforcement approach captured in the slogan, War on Drugs, has completely failed, and that there be no doubt about it. All evidence shows that while seizures of drugs, arrests, and incarcerations have increased over the years, yet the world has not become drug-free. While short-term successes may have been achieved, the long-term effect it actually produces is a stimulus to illicit drug production. Illegal drug manufacture and use is simply increasing. The inevitable conclusion is that the prohibitionist drug policies, laws, and practices have failed to achieve the objective of drug conventions or getting rid of drug addiction. Moreover, the prohibitionist regime spawned criminal syndicates and gangs. Who are the people who are benefiting out of it? It is the criminal gangs, not the ordinary people, who thrive on the exorbitant profits to be made in the illegal drugs market. Because there is a difference between the legal price, which the hospital will get for morphine, and opium on the grey market, there are criminals who benefit from it. Prohibition was also responsible for the trade shifting from opium to heroin and from opium smoking to injecting heroin, and the consequential transmission of bloodborne diseases, including HIV and hepatitis B and C. In fact, there is fairly well documented evidence to show that it is because of the drug laws that HIV actually went up. I'm not going into detail about that. Criminalization has resulted in the arrest and the imprisonment of large numbers of people for drug-related offenses. In my country, 50% of the people who are in prison in Punjab are drug-related offenders. In South Africa, in 2014, 215,944 people were arrested for drug-related offenses alone, constituting about 15% of the total arrests. Most of these arrests are of drug users and small-scale suppliers. Now, I've got this data from the judgments based on evidence given by the South African government. In a number of countries, nearly half or more of the prison population comprise drug users for whom incarceration has no effect in reducing or altering drug use pattern. So what is the purpose of sending people to jail? Such wasteful policies are a huge burden on the taxpayers. So we pay money for a policy which doesn't work. What is the purpose of it? More importantly, in terms of health, the avowed objective of the drug conventions, the consequences are even more disastrous. In prisons, drug users do not have access to preventative and treatment health services. The already high prevalence of hepatitis C and HIV amongst drug users in prisons is only exacerbated. Harm reduction, promoting and making available accessible needle syringe and other facilities are well-known evidence-based methods known to reduce risk of transmission of communicable diseases, including HIV or HCV. Similarly, evidence-based treatment for drug dependence, namely buprenorphine substitution and methadone maintenance, or OST, is well known. On account of the war on drugs, these critical medical facilities are simply not available in most countries. Thankfully, because of the HIV epidemic, a number of developing countries, with a significant push from the UNAIDS and the Global Fund on TB, HIV, and malaria, have been able to provide harm reduction services and OST services for IDUs in safe havens. Fortunately, South Africa too has started to provide key harm reduction interventions for people who use drugs. But although known to be successful, overall in Africa, the coverage of these interventions remains very limited and restricted to a few cities. It has been estimated that less than 1% of the people who inject drugs in sub-Saharan Africa have access to needle syringe programs or OST, while less than 1% of HIV positive people or people living with HIV who inject drugs are under antiretroviral therapy. In addition, most existing harm reduction services only rely on international funding, creating problems for their sustainability. While HIV has been addressed in terms of prevention and treatment, hepatitis C or HCV, a larger and a rising epidemic, has been completely ignored in developing countries. The routes of transmission are practically the same as HIV, but hepatitis C is more transmissible than HIV. Seroprevalence of HCV is over 4 times higher than HIV. Vulnerable groups, particularly people who use drugs, are often co-infected with HIV, TB, and hepatitis C. Thus, there's an urgent need to address hepatitis C epidemic and make available not only facilities for testing, but also make available treatment for the same. Fortunately, now with the advent of new and better drugs, HCV is completely curable across genotypes within a short period, say of 6 months to 1 year. However, these drugs are prohibitively expensive available in the US for $84,000 for a course because of patents. Moreover, the voluntary licensing practices resorted to by the corporations, being deliberately restrictive, doesn't allow the availability of drugs in countries where it is most needed. Fortunately, South Africa and India, because Indian drug companies are sending those drugs across, they are available to South Africans and Indians. But in Latin America, in Central and Eastern Europe, drugs are the same price as the US. So ordinary people who are living with HCV cannot get a cure which is available. And what is the result? People are dying. And all because of a patent system, all because the multinational corporations are not happy with $10, they want $1,000. That's the reality. The other deleterious consequence of criminalization of drug use is that millions of people worldwide who require essential medicines for treatment and palliative care are unable to access them. Excessive restrictions, sanctions imposed by law instills fear in the medical community who don't prescribe or administer palliative medicines, resulting in needless pain and suffering for patients and their families. Basically, say for example, a person who's living with HIV, last stages of his or her life, or a transgender person's life. I don't use he or she anymore. I did that case in India also, transgender. So the person's life who's living with HIV or cancer, the last stage is the most painful. My mother went through, she wasn't living with HIV, but she broke her bones, and I saw it firsthand. The only palliative is morphine, controlled dose. It's not available. In India, it's only available in one state. We actually changed the law, but the medical community is afraid because to go through those regulations is so complex. They don't want to do it. And this is the result of the war on drugs. But it's only in the developing countries where it is not available. The developed countries who force these laws on us, they're very happy. They are getting it. My mother got it because she lived in England. But if I had the same problem, I would need a lot of money to get it. Now, even the most commonly used anesthetic, which is used in rural areas in the developing world, including in Africa, namely ketamine, is sought to be included in the 1971 convention. This will only restrict the access to life-saving surgeries in remote areas. It has already been included in the Indian law. Significantly, over 75% of the all legally controlled medicines are consumed in North America and Europe. As a result, over 70 to 90% of the patients who require these essential medicines in developing countries do not have access to such medicine. That apart, in some countries, treatment that is administered due to allegedly drug-dependent persons is not evidence-based. Authorities resort to compulsory detention and treatment programs of persons who allegedly are drug-dependent. Even persons who are not drug-dependent are forced into compulsory detention centers. If I take cannabis, I may not be drug dependent. And another person who's drug dependent may need services. But both are pushed into compulsory detention centers. They are accompanied by punishment, sometimes forced unpaid labor, solitary confinement, and experimental treatment without consent. A vast majority of drug users who pass through such compulsory detention centers return to drug use after the compulsory period of detention and detoxification programs. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, I had reviewed such practices, both on my missions as well as on the reports, and found them to be incompatible with, and indeed, in violation of the right to health enshrined in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The punitive approach to drug use has resulted in a large number of countries in the world, about 33, a large number of them in my region, Asia, resorting to death penalty for certain drug-related offenses. Apart from the fact that death penalty does not achieve its stated objective of deterrence, resorting to it for drug-related offences is contrary to Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This mandates, first, the progressive reduction of capital crimes aimed at abolition of death penalty, and second, restricting it to the most serious of crimes, such as those that result in the death of another person. International law does not recognize drug offenses as the most serious crime. Unfortunately, despite that, death penalty continues to be used in a number of countries, with more than half of the reported drug-related offenses alone. In the Asian region, about 10 countries have mandatory death sentences for death-related offenses. In constitutional jurisprudence, mandatory death penalty has no place, as it takes away from the judicial body's discretion in sentencing. As a country that has abolished death penalty, I look towards South Africa to lead on a call for the end to death penalty for drug-related offenses internationally. While all these are serious and unfortunate consequences of the drug prohibition, the most profound impact of criminalization is in impairing and impinging on the dignity of the people who use drugs. Seen as morally depraved and blameworthy and stigmatized, drug users are treated as criminals, less than human, undeserving of respect, rights, and opportunities. Not only do others, state and society, treat the people who use drugs with contempt, the persons who use drugs may themselves imbibe this sense of unworthiness and denigrate oneself. This is the point that the professor made. Nothing, and nothing, I repeat, can be more deleterious than that. So what is the way forward? Indeed, the roots of the path in the future in South Africa may have been indicated in the minority decision of the Constitutional Court in Gareth Prince versus President of Law Society, popularly known in this country as Prince 2, where the issue whether the prohibition of possession and consumption of cannabis could be accommodated for a Rastafari to practice his religion. Though on the main issue, Justin Nkobo was in a minority of 4-5, he makes an important observation, namely, in terms of Article 36(1)(a) of the Single Convention, the criminalization of the listed forms of conduct must take place subject to the party, that is the state's constitutional limitation. If the Constitution doesn't have the same provisions and is contrary to it, you can have a different policy. He also notes in a footnote that at international law, states may adopt steps to legalize the personal possession and use of cannabis without falling foul of international drug conventions. Therefore, in law it is clear that states are entitled to interpret drug conventions in terms of their constitutional principles. International law allows the option of decriminalizing, legalizing, and regulating. The position in law is reiterated in Prince 3, a decision of the Western Cape Division of the South African High Court, where Davis J. notes that the International Narcotic Control Board, an independent quasi-judicial monitoring body for the implementation of drug conventions, in its report states that criminalization is not the only option under the drug conventions. In Prince 3, Davis J. also refers to the position statement, and I'm told the South African Drug Authority is here, in 2016, which states, and it's noted in that decision, the immediate focus should be on decriminalization rather than legalization. So, there is something there. Drawing on the judicial decisions of the Argentinian Supreme Court in Ariolia case, the Alaskan Supreme Court in the Ravine case, and the Mexican Supreme Court, the Court of the Western Cape Division of the South African High Court held that the provisions relating to cannabis, both in the Drugs Act and the Medicines Act, were invalid to the extent that they prohibit the use of cannabis by an adult in a private dwelling where the possession, purchase, or cultivation of cannabis is for personal consumption by an adult. So a very important decision which we can build on. It also suspended the operation of the order for 24 months for Parliament in South Africa to correct the defect in law. In the meantime, the use of cannabis for the purpose permitted in the judgment can be used as a defense in a criminal case. So Parliament has been given the mandate. In my opinion, these decisions of South Africa clearly not only point a way forward, but also give the legislature an impetus to act. Today we have some countries that impose mandatory death penalty for simple possession of drugs. On the other hand, there are others who have not only started decriminalization, but also legalization and regulation of the possession and use of drugs. The list of the countries is growing and now includes Portugal, Austria, Estonia, Czech Republic, etc. I'm not getting into it. And most importantly, the US. 13 states. The choice for South Africa, in my opinion is clear. Go down the path on the war of drugs and make our citizens or your citizens criminals. That's one path. Or decriminalize or legalize and treat them like human beings with dignity, with all human rights intact. In my opinion, for any sensible person, there is no question of what choice should be made. So what steps are to be taken? First, there must be a debate on the issue of drug use in all circles, political, legal, social, communal. Second, there must be a recognition that the strategy of the war on drugs has failed and has had disastrous consequences on the health and welfare of humankind, the avowed objective of the conventions. Third, adopt laws, policies, and practices which are evidence-based. Fourth, people who use drugs must be accorded respect and dignity and treated like every other human being without discrimination. Fortunately, there are winds of change. The US, which initiated and has been in the leadership on the war of drugs, is seeing those very changes. A number of states have seen the futility of the war on drugs and legalized the use of marijuana for medical purposes as well as recreation. It is important to note that these reforms are strengthening and not weakening drug control. The punitive regimes of drug laws must be replaced with decriminalization, legalization, and regulatory measures. If we can do this for alcohol and tobacco, there is no reason why we cannot do it for other drugs. The South African Western Cape Court of the South African High Court actually mentions that alcohol is far more deleterious in terms not only of the effects, but in terms of numbers. The response must be based primarily, as the objective of the convention says, on health and welfare of humankind and on the right to health framework enshrined under Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which mandates that health goods, services and facilities be made available and be of good quality. Health goods, facilities and services must be made available without discrimination. Preventative and treatment services, including harm reduction services, OST and essential medicines for palliative care, must be made available and accessible without discrimination and with full informed consent of the proposed recipients. Death penalty for drug-related offenses must go. It doesn't work and is against international law. This can form the basis of discussion with our governments so they can make changes on drug policy, not only in South Africa, but be in the lead in the world. In the era of the HIV epidemic, we learned that rights-based approach works. The key component of that strategy was the involvement of the affected communities in shaping the response. This is what I learned from my South African comrades in the HIV arena. You, the communities and activists in South Africa, can again take the mantle of leadership in the arena of drug use and human rights so that humanity returns to this country and the world. Thank you very much.